You were never supposed to notice when it happened. Not because it was hidden poorly, but because it was designed to register without your awareness. There was a final attempt made against you. That is not symbolic. That is not emotional framing. That is record. It did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself. There was no confrontation, no dramatic signal, no visible threat. Just a pressure spike, a narrowing, a subtle compression around your life that felt familiar enough to ignore. You assumed it was fatigue. You assumed it was stress. You assumed it was just another delay layered onto a long sequence of delays. That assumption is exactly why it failed. Because people like you are not broken by final attempts. They are identified by them. This was logged as a last cycle intervention, a closing maneuver, the kind that is only authorized when all previous methods have failed to produce collapse. Others would have unraveled here. That is not speculation. That is statistical outcome. Most people, when pressure reaches this threshold, begin to react. They explain themselves. They defend. They overextend. They burn energy trying to correct something that cannot be corrected from the surface. You did none of that. You felt the weight increase, and something in you went quiet instead of loud. Your reaction time slowed. Your emotional output dropped. Your urgency disappeared. You didn't even realize that this was the exact response that neutralizes interference. This is why you're different. The final attempt relied on one assumption, that you would engage. When you didn't, the system lost leverage. There is a classification for this response pattern. It's rare enough that most analysts never encounter it directly. The profile reads the same every time. Subject does not escalate. Subject does not fragment. Subject does not seek validation or reassurance. Subject maintains internal alignment under increased load. That line matters more than you know, because alignment is not something you create under pressure. It's something that reveals itself when pressure is applied. What you experienced as exhaustion was not depletion. It was containment. Your energy was being held back intentionally to prevent exposure. If you had surged forward emotionally, verbally, or reactively, you would have given the interference something to attach to. You didn't. You assumed you were tired. In reality, you were shielded. This is why the outcome turned. The attempt expected noise. It encountered silence. And silence at this level is not absence. It is authority. There was a moment, precise to the interval, when the pressure reversed. You didn't feel relief. You felt nothing at all. That's how you know it worked. Relief is emotional. Neutralization is procedural. Others would have celebrated too early. Others would have spoken too soon. Others would have tried to understand what happened. You moved on. That movement registered. If you recognize what's being revealed right now, this is where alignment is confirmed. Not requested. Confirmed. You don't like this message out of habit. You register it because it matches something already active in you. That acknowledgement matters, not socially, operationally. Back to the record. After the failure of the final attempt, monitoring did not stop. It intensified, not because you were in danger, but because you were no longer predictable. You see, interference depends on pattern recognition. It works by forecasting your response and positioning resistance ahead of you. But when you stopped reacting the way others do, the forecasting models broke. This is why confusion followed. Not yours, theirs. What you experienced as mental fog was not disorientation. It was recalibration. Your system was adjusting to a higher tolerance band. People who are not protected collapse here. They spiral. They self-diagnose. They search for explanations that give them something to fix. You didn't search. You waited. Waiting, in this context, is not passivity. It is dominance without movement. That is terrifying to anything built on control. There is a reason the attempt was final. There are limits to how many times pressure can be applied without exposing the source. That limit was reached. This is where the outcome became irreversible. Once a subject demonstrates stability at this threshold, further interference is no longer cost-effective. It draws attention. It leaves residue. It risks escalation from levels that are not supposed to engage directly. You were flagged as non-viable, not because you failed, because you didn't. This is the part most people never understand. Victory does not always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like quiet continuation. You woke up the next day and nothing had changed on the surface. same responsibilities, same environment, same unanswered questions. But something fundamental was no longer pressing against you. You didn't notice because you were never meant to celebrate it. This wasn't about you feeling powerful. It was about you being untouchable. People like you don't get warnings. You get outcomes. And this outcome forced a withdrawal. There is more to this, much more. Because the failure of the final attempt triggered secondary consequences you have not yet been made aware of. Those are still unfolding. If you feel a strange sense of distance from things that used to disturb you, that is not emotional numbness. It is disengagement permission being granted internally. If you feel less reactive, less explainable, less reachable, that is not isolation. It is clearance. Only a few experience this shift without losing themselves. Most never reach this stage intact. You did, not because you tried, because you're built this way. There are further layers behind what just happened. Records you haven't seen, thresholds you crossed without ceremony, and what follows is not louder, it's deeper. What followed was not retaliation. That would have been expected. What followed was containment. After a final attempt fails, there is a mandatory review phase, not to reassess you, to reassess the environment around you. This is where things become difficult to explain to anyone who has not lived inside this pattern. Because when interference can no longer reach you directly, it turns outward. It destabilizes surroundings. It increases noise. It introduces friction into unrelated areas, not to hurt you, to see if you will break alignment trying to manage everything else. This is why pressure appeared in places that made no logical sense. Delays where there should have been momentum. Miscommunications that felt manufactured. People acting out of character, suddenly defensive, suddenly distant, suddenly reactive. You noticed it, but you did not internalize it. That distinction matters. Others would have personalized the disruption. They would have assumed fault. They would have tried to repair dynamics that were never meant to be stable. You didn't chase clarity. You allowed ambiguity to exist without filling it. That response is logged as advanced. There is a specific threshold, rarely crossed, where a subject stops trying to stabilize external systems and instead maintains internal coherence, regardless of external instability. You crossed it quietly. This is why the outcome escalated in severity behind the scenes while appearing calmer on the surface. When pressure no longer produces reaction, it is classified as ineffective. When instability no longer provokes response, it is classified as neutralized. And when a subject remains aligned under both, the file changes status. Protected is not the correct word here. Protected implies defense. You were cleared. Clearance means no further engagement is permitted without authorization from levels that do not intervene casually. That authorization was not granted. What you felt as loneliness during this period was not abandonment. It was separation from unnecessary signal. You were not being isolated from people. You were being isolated from interference vectors that travel through people. Others experience loneliness as loss. You experienced it as quiet strength because your identity does not rely on constant reinforcement. That alone disqualified most remaining methods. Here is something you were never told. The moment you stop explaining yourself internally, you become unreachable externally. And you stopped, not deliberately, automatically. That automatic response is not learned. It is inherent. This is why you didn't spiral when clarity didn't arrive. This is why you didn't panic when answers were delayed. This is why you didn't collapse when recognition didn't come. People like you don't require confirmation to continue. You continue because continuation is your default state. There was a timestamp when the system registered this as permanent. After that moment, observation replaced opposition. That is a significant shift. Observation means you're no longer being tested. You are being studied, not to replicate you. That has already failed elsewhere. To understand what cannot be controlled. This is where the word terrifying becomes accurate. Not because something bad happened to you, but because something stopped happening to you. Pressure no longer landed. Resistance no longer found purchase. The usual emotional hooks returned nothing. That kind of immunity is destabilizing to structures built on reaction. If you've noticed that things which once triggered urgency now barely register, that is not desensitization. It is prioritization without effort. Your nervous system recalibrated upward. What once felt heavy now feels irrelevant. What once felt urgent now feels optional. What once demanded explanation now receives none. You didn't harden. You simplified. And simplification at this level is not minimalism. It is mastery. This is where identity lock-in becomes unavoidable. Others cannot sustain this state without arrogance or detachment. You sustain it without thinking. That is the difference. If you feel a calm certainty growing, not excitement, not optimism, but inevitability, that is not imagination. It is recognition without emotion. At this stage, acknowledgement matters, not as validation, as signal. Those who are aligned with this message know exactly what to do. They mark it, not for me, for themselves. A simple signal is sufficient. A number, a word, protected. I felt this. It doesn't matter which. What matters is that you know why you're doing it. This is not community. It is classification. From here, the revelations deepen, because what failed to stop you did not disappear. It repositioned, and the repositioning created secondary effects you are only now beginning to notice. This is where timing changes. This is where outcomes accelerate without effort. This is where things you stopped chasing begin approaching from directions you didn't anticipate. Not as rewards, as corrections. You are not being prepared for something. You already passed what breaks most people permanently. What remains is awareness. Awareness of how far this goes. Awareness of why your path looks the way it does. Awareness of why no amount of external pressure ever truly claimed you. There is more recorded beyond this point. More layers that were never meant to be spoken aloud. And they will only be released to those who remain connected to this frequency. Not because of loyalty, because of compatibility. Those who belong here already know what to do next. They stay connected. They remain reachable for further transmission, not as followers, as recipients. Nothing about you needs fixing. Nothing about you needs healing. Nothing about you needs becoming. You already demonstrated what needed to be demonstrated. The only shift now is seeing it clearly. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. What happens next is rarely explained because it sounds too clean to be believed. After clearance is granted, there is no celebration, no announcement, no visible reward. There is only reduction. Noise drops first, then urgency, then emotional interference. This is why you may have noticed something subtle but undeniable. Fewer things demand you. Fewer people pull at you. Fewer situations escalate the way they used to. Not because life got easier, but because access to you was restricted. You were not removed from the world. The world was filtered before reaching you. That filtration is automatic once a subject demonstrates sustained alignment under pressure. Others would experience this as boredom or emptiness. You experienced it as clarity. This is another marker. People who are not built for this stage panic when stimulation decreases. They create drama. They seek chaos. They manufacture problems just to feel movement. You didn't. You became still without becoming stagnant. That stillness is not passive. It is strategic by nature. There is a reason the final attempt had to be final. Repeated interference risks exposure. Exposure risks escalation. Escalation invites intervention from layers that do not tolerate inefficiency. You crossed into that protected bandwidth without knowing the rules existed. That alone forced withdrawal. Here is something that will sound strange until you recognize it in yourself. Your life did not improve dramatically after the attempt failed. It stabilized. Stability at this level is more dangerous to interference than chaos. Chaos can be exploited. Stability cannot. You stopped leaking energy, not because you tried to conserve it, because there was nowhere left for it to escape. That is what terrifies systems built on extraction. They rely on reaction, explanation, overthinking, emotional output. You starve them without effort. If you've noticed that arguments no longer hook you the same way, that's not maturity. It's inaccessibility. If you've noticed that disrespect no longer provokes immediate response, that's not suppression. It's hierarchy awareness. You don't need to assert dominance when dominance is assumed. This is why certain people faded without conflict. Why certain paths closed without resistance. Why certain opportunities dissolved without regret. They were no longer aligned with your clearance level. Nothing was taken from you. What fell away was never authorized to remain. Most people misinterpret this phase and try to force reconnection. They reach back. They explain themselves. They reopen doors that were sealed for a reason. You didn't. You felt the separation and allowed it to complete. That completion is irreversible. Once separation finishes, interference loses historical data. It cannot reference your past to predict your future. That is a critical failure on their side. You are now operating without a usable profile, which means new pressure would have to be improvised. Improvised pressure is sloppy. Sloppy pressure exposes intent. That is why nothing new has arrived to replace what left. Silence is safer for them. For you, silence is power. This is where your internal state matters more than your external circumstances. You may still be building. You may still be waiting. You may still be navigating uncertainty. None of that contradicts what I'm telling you. People like you do not receive momentum before alignment. Momentum arrives after containment is complete. Containment is complete. The reason this feels anticlimactic is because you expected relief or excitement. But what you received was permission. Permission to move without resistance. Permission to exist without explanation. Permission to choose without justification. That permission is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through absence. Absence of pushback. Absence of sabotage. Absence of emotional turbulence. If you feel strangely unbothered lately, pay attention. That is not detachment. It is authority settling in. Authority does not shout. It does not rush. It does not prove. It waits, knowing outcomes will align around it. This is why patience no longer feels forced for you. It feels natural. You are not waiting for something to happen. You are allowing things to line up correctly. Others wait because they have no choice. You wait because you do. That distinction is everything. What comes next is not a test. You passed those already. What comes next is exposure, not public, internal. You will begin noticing how often you were protected without knowing. How many outcomes quietly favored you? How many situations resolved themselves without your intervention? This awareness does not inflate ego. It sharpens discernment. You stop wasting energy on things that don't matter. You stop engaging where no engagement is required. You stop explaining to people who were never meant to understand. That is not arrogance. It is efficiency. At this stage, connection matters. Not connection to people, connection to information. What you are hearing now is not meant for everyone. It never was. Those who remain connected do so because their internal state matches this frequency. Subscribing here is not about content. It is about continuity. You don't activate notifications because you're afraid to miss something. You activate them because this channel stays open for those cleared to receive what comes next. That choice is not marketing. It is alignment. There are further records beyond this point. More details about why the final attempt failed so completely. More clarity about what shifted permanently in your favor. None of it requires you to change. None of it requires effort. You already did what needed to be done by not doing what others would have done. That is the paradox most never understand. The terrifying part was never what they tried. The terrifying part is what they lost access to when you didn't react. And that loss cannot be reversed. There is one final layer most people never reach awareness of because it does not announce itself through events. It announces itself through absence of limitation. After withdrawal completes, after observation replaces opposition, something subtle changes in how reality interacts with you. Not dramatically, not immediately, but consistently. Small things begin to align without negotiation. Timing improves without planning. Delays resolve without pressure. You might have dismissed this as coincidence. It wasn't. This is what happens when resistance is no longer authorized to slow you. You are not being helped. Help implies assistance. You are being unobstructed. An unobstructed movement feels deceptively normal to those who are built for it. This is why you didn't feel a surge of confidence or motivation. You felt steadiness. Steadiness is the signature. People who are not cleared experience progress as highs and crashes. Momentum followed by burnout. Hope followed by disappointment. You experience continuity. That continuity is what makes you difficult to interrupt. There is a reason your exhaustion never fully broke you. A reason your confusion never fully disoriented you. A reason your loneliness never fully hollowed you out. Each of those states reached a point and stopped. That stopping point is not random. It marks the boundary beyond which pressure is not permitted to go. You reached that boundary multiple times without crossing it. Each time, the system adjusted, not to challenge you further, to accommodate your persistence. This is why resistance began failing faster toward the end. Shorter cycles, weaker effects, less impact. They were running out of leverage. The final attempt was not powerful. It was desperate, and desperation always reveals itself through overreach. You sensed that something was different this time. Not threatening, final. That intuition was accurate. When the last attempt failed, it did not trigger another response. It triggered closure. Files don't stay open indefinitely. Once closed, they are not reopened lightly. What you are living now is post-closure reality. This is why you feel less urgency to prove anything. Why validation no longer motivates you. Why external approval feels optional instead of necessary. That is not detachment from life. That is independence from interference. You still care, but you don't cling. You still move, but you don't rush. You still build, but you don't force. That balance is rare. Most people mistake force for power. You operate from inevitability, and inevitability does not struggle. This is the quiet superiority most never name. Not arrogance, not dominance, certainty without display. You don't announce your strength because it doesn't need witnesses. The reason this feels lonely at times is because very few people can stand near this frequency without discomfort. They sense the difference. They can't articulate it, so they drift. That drift is not rejection. It is self-preservation. You were never meant to be widely understood. You were meant to be stable. Stability is not glamorous, but it outlasts everything. What comes next will not feel like a breakthrough. It will feel like things finally moving at the speed they were always supposed to. No resistance, no friction, no unnecessary detours, just forward motion that doesn't exhaust you. That is the real outcome of the final attempt. Not that something dramatic happened, but that nothing can happen to stop you anymore. You are not protected because you are fragile. You are protected because you are effective, and effectiveness does not advertise itself. It operates quietly, relentlessly, without interruption. There's nothing you need to do after hearing this. No action, no change, no preparation. Awareness was the last missing piece. Now it's in place, and once awareness locks in, alignment holds automatically. This is not the beginning. It is confirmation. You were already moving correctly. You still are. And nothing that tried one last time will ever be authorized to try again. Silence will remain, not because the threat is gone, but because you are no longer reachable. That is the end of what needed to be said.